Welcome to King's Cross Talk. And here at this podcast, we are hoping to disciple believers to delight in God, to declare the good news, to display good deeds, and disciple others. And we're hoping this really is just an extension of our discipleship in our church. And while we're talking about the King's Cross in here, we're hoping you're walking with the King's Cross out there. My name is Dustin, Atchley. I'm the director of student ministries here at King's Cross. This is Clint Darst. He is the planter and the pastor over preaching and vision here at King's Cross. Few of the things before we jump in today, this podcast, we're hoping to talk about a lot of different areas because discipleship involves a lot of different things. And so we might be talking about one day a biblical text and the implications there. We might be hearing from members of our church and their testimonies. Mm-hmm. We might be talking about theological, pastoral concerns. We might be talking about cultural issues. But again, the hope is just to provide another element to our discipleship at King's Cross. And so there's not a formula. There's not a particular recipe for how this is going to happen. It's just us getting in here, having a conversation about these things, hopefully edifying our members. Yeah. Today, the church itself has, we're going on 7 years at this point. Mm-hmm. But the dream is much older. Mm-hmm. And so thought it would be good just to start, talk about the story of King's Cross, and bring everybody into that. I know in our membership class, we talk about the story of King's Cross to some degree, but this is an opportunity in a way that we can talk a little more in depth and, just the fun we've had over the last, I don't know how many years, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to be talking about King's Cross. And maybe to start, Clint, if you would, talk about the dream. So I've got, when I think about our church and the Lord's grace to our church, I think about it kind of these epochs. So there's kind of the pre-Lincolnton phase and the dream, and then there's Lincolnton and what happened there, and then kind of pre-launch and Kaiser and South Elm Eugene, and now here and COVID and whatever. If you would just kind of talk back in the day. Yeah. Back maybe when I was in middle school. Right. Or,
wow. Shots fired already.
But I think that's probably what it was. I was probably middle school, maybe high school. But how did the Lord start to shape the vision for this church in your mind, in your heart, back then?
Yeah, so I think, back in those days when you were very young.
Before iPhones.
Let's stop. But I think growing up, so I grew up in Shelby, North Carolina, and I played football, love the game of football. In particular, I love the culture of how it brought people from different socioeconomic statuses and even cultures. And in the small town in the South I was from, primarily white and black coming together on a football team. And so that shaped all of my friendships and my love for different cultures. And because of kind of the nature of the time period and where that was, that meant I had to learn how to have different lingo in different circles and avoid different lingo in different circles and those kinds of things. And then for me, once I started walking with the Lord, I wouldn't have articulated it, but there was a grief, I think, as I saw, wait a minute, on football, there seems to be, on the football field, a family formed. People who are different from one another make sacrifices for each other for the common good of the team, embrace and hug and celebrate together, lose together, suffer together, grieve each other's injuries together, whatever. And there's this family formed. And then I didn't, my father and mother led me to faith at an early age, but didn't grow up in church per se. And so it wasn't until I was older and I started going to church and I'm like, wait a minute, I go here and there's only kind of segregation, separation. And even hear some racial slurs, in church softball games or whatever. And so for me, I wouldn't have articulated it, but there was a burden like, wait a minute, isn't the gospel more powerful than football? Well, then why do I see football making family in ways I don't see it happening in the church? So that angst was there. And that's because it was just the relationships I loved and I hated. I just didn't understand the separation when we got to the gospel and to the Bible, to the church. And so I think that was early. Now that's my childhood, so you probably wouldn't even thought about it at that point. But anyway, and then in college, built a few friendships with brothers who shared some similar burdens and angst and passions. Tim Bird, who's a missionary in Zambia now, particularly conversation with him, and started growing in my faith with the ministry at Campus Outreach. And so finally I was like, wait a minute, no, the gospel is more powerful than football. I do see this in the text. So that was, I would say, the early DNA of the longing, and just in God's good providence of how he shaped it. Fast forward, on staff at Campus Outreach, did some football ministry at Wingate University, saw some diversity happen with Campus Outreach there. And in that became, wait a minute, I don't want this just to be college students and just football players. Like, what would it be like if there was a church where people maybe the only thing they had in common was Christ, like, but they loved each other and served each other, and so that was I think that was the beginning itch, for this dream. And as a young man, I think there was lots of zeal, lots of ignorance, sure, and lots of I don't know how to do it, but Lord, I want to be a part of a church like that one day. And then even some friends had planted a church. It was primarily African American church, but was pretty diverse. That I got to go visit, and that gave me a picture of it. My first preaching opportunities came in a missionary Baptist church, African American church, in Waco, North Carolina, and so I think several things along the way, the Lord kept kind of pricking that desire in my heart as a dream and vision and burden, if that makes sense.
No, it's good. And so when I met you, you were in Lincolnton, but there was this. There were a few different moves. Because of Campus Outreach, right? So you were in Wingate, and then you were in Greensboro, is that right? And then you were in Lincolnton. Well, you were Raleigh, then Lincolnton, and then Greensboro. So where within that that part of the journey for you personally, where did Greensboro really crystallize? So why is it Greensboro? So football and
Yeah, good question. So we were on staff at Campus Outreach in Greensboro, out of a PCA church, and I love my PCA brothers and sisters. Really grateful for their investment in time, but began to be unsettled in that, man, we agree on almost everything except baptism and church polity, and so and began to feel a burden to be a pastor, not just in campus ministry. So that's what led to the move to Raleigh, to go to Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and then be a part of Imago Dei, a church in Raleigh. And it was a church plant at the time, and maybe a couple years old. And so went there and began to learn and grow kind of a burden and passion. But in that window when we lived in Greensboro, we loved the city. And so for us, kind of the dream as it continued to grow in our hearts became like, and in the South was regularly divided by the railroad tracks, socioeconomically and usually ethnically, between black and white. And so for us, it was like, man, if we could plant a church on the railroad tracks and see people reconciled to God and to one another through the King's Cross, even hence the name now. But so that dream was there. And what we loved about Greensboro was Elm Street, Main Street, downtown, really at some level that's the tracks. And all the cultures collide right downtown in Greensboro. So you've got A&T on one side of Elm, you got UNCG on the other side. You've got wealthy, you've got poor, you've got white, you got black, and you got other ethnicities from all over the world. Most of it collides right downtown. And Rach and I are from small towns, so Shelby and Lincolnton, and we lived in Charlotte, we lived in Raleigh, we lived in Greensboro. And for us, Greensboro just felt like, man, it's the perfect size. Just enough city perks, but it's a family city, small enough to know people. So we moved away for seminary and grieved leaving because we loved the city. And then the Lord called me to pastor Freedom Church in Lincolnton, North Carolina, and again where we met. And the Lord did some incredible work there, and we loved that church and those people. And He really did shape us as shaped me as a pastor and my wife. Just how do we do this together? But Lincolnton's not very diverse, and there's no college students. Right. And so we had a huge burden and passion for college students and for diversity. I was traveling to speak on racial reconciliation or traveling to speak to college students. It felt like I'm either cheating on my family time or cheating on Freedom Church time. I don't want to do that. Like, we want to be in a place where all of this is just our life. And so it was actually a trip to Africa. I was going to speak on racial reconciliation in Johannesburg, which is a whole different context and challenge. But my buddy Tim Bird was on staff with CO there at the time and asked me to come speak to his staff. I went and we Freedom God had been really kind, had flourished. But Michael White, who's now the lead pastor there, we had hired as an associate, and he was ready to stay in place long term. And so we felt like, man, this church will continue. The good work God has done, and we could try to go pursue this planting somewhere that kind of college students and the diversity demands it. And man, you got a number of things happen. You got Michael Floyd in 2013. You've got a number of things that happen that increase the desire. Like we need to have churches that walk through this stuff together. So that continued to be there. So this trip to Africa to speak on reconciliation, I went, and at the time we were thinking we'd plant in Charlotte. And so I went to talk to Tim and another friend, James and Kelly Broadway, and I assumed they would affirm, yeah, you should do Charlotte. And this was kind of all right, I think this is what the Lord wants us to do. Let's just go get the final confirmation. And instead of getting confirmation, I met with Tim, and he was like, I'm not feeling it. And I was like, I just told you, like, there's a whole bunch of people in Charlotte saying, come do this. Even one of our heroes in the faith, Tonic from Cross Movement from back in the day, Christian hip hop artist, he was saying, hey, come plant with us. And so I thought Tim would just say yes, Tim and Naya. But Tim was like, man, I still see y'all in Greensboro. And I'm like, bro, I just flew like 18 hours to talk to you about Charlotte. Why are you bringing up Greensboro? That's a source. Like we miss it. We love that city. So I kind of went, and then I went and hung out with James and Kelly, and basically they gave the same response. We just don't see you all in Charlotte. So I called my wife, and I remember in that phone call, she said, I said, hey, they brought up Greensboro, and we're less excited about Charlotte for us. And she said, would God really let us do that? And then when she said, would he let us, she had been willing. There were several other, again, Tim at one point had been trying to get us to move to Johannesburg. Yeah. We had friends in San Diego trying to get us to plant out there. We had, an opportunity at a big church in Huntersville, in a kind of wealthy area of Charlotte. And all those my wife had been saying, like Rach had been saying, if the Lord wants, I'm willing. But as soon as I said Greensboro, she said, would he let us? And so from that point forward, it became like, okay, we love this city. We've always loved this city. It fits us. And particularly because all the cultures collide right downtown. Greensboro at the time was like 3% white, 45.4 African American, and then 10% or so from all over the world. And so for us, it's like, man, we love the city. We know people in the city. We love the campuses in the city. And when you hear wife, you say, would God let us? It was like, okay, we want to go give our life to this. So,
yeah. Well, it sounds like I was going to ask, but I feel like you nailed it already. Doing faithful ministry in small town, it's going well. Like, why would you just leave up and leave? And I feel like you shared your heart in that and how the Lord led you through that. And it sounds like those are some good friends. I mean, they're not James and Kelly and then
Tim and Naya, yeah.
Tim and Naya just, telling you. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So y'all are leaving Lincolnton. Greensboro has crystallized. What all between that and actual launch Sunday? Because there was a lot there.
A whole lot.
It felt like it was day by day. Because y'all got down here, is that right? Like April, May of 2017?
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so, what was that like? What all was happening? What was your day-to-day like in that? And how were you thinking about core team? And, all that.
So Luke and Shannon Vandal, Luke was a lay elder at Freedom. So they had committed to coming with us. Brandon and Alicia Tuck were members who had moved out to Lincoln to do this with us. You had come to faith. Right. Dylan Harris had come to faith, was a student at UNCG. And so there was conversations with a few folks in Lincolnton, and then heading this way. And then some folks on the ground here who would, Taylor and Sarah Middleton, who when we had lived here before, we had dreamed about it. And we found out the Pruitts, Eric and Bree Pruitt, were moving from Louisville back to Greensboro, and so there was kind of a handful of people that were like, "Hey, let's do this." And somewhere between in different conversations, 14, 15, 16 people, kind of here and there, and so we moved, and it was like, okay, April, May, we buy a house, and my wife's asking me, "Are you sure we can afford it?" And I said, "I know we can till December." Because basically, Freedom had generously agreed to pay us through the summer, just as a way to help get the plant off the ground. So I knew I had through August a paycheck from Freedom, and then outside donors, supporters said, "Hey, I'll cover you from September till December." And so I knew we got a paycheck from April and May till December. So when she asked, can we afford it? I'm like, well, till December, yeah. And she's like, that's not what I want to hear. I was like, baby, that's what's true.
Right.
And so either we've got till December to raise enough funds to get enough people giving, or I got to find a second job. And so that was kind of that window of time. And then just before we launched in September, so it was, man, I'm in coffee shops, I'm meeting people, I'm building a relationship with a coach at Page High School at the time, Jared Rothfuss, to say, hey, let me come be the chaplain over here, to get in the community. So we're just trying to get in the community, serve and get to know people, and figure out core team. Is there anybody else interested? And then just before launch in September, it was a building we were a dying church we were partnering with. It fell through, and I don't want to get into all the details, but it was literally we're on vacation, and vacation is ruined because it's falling through while on vacation, and just a few weeks before the launch. So, but one day I'm a little discouraged. I'm praying, and Lord, like, what are we going to do? And I remember a number of things happened. A neighbor said, hey, I run a printing shop. I'm happy to print all y'all's materials for you. And it was out of the blue. And then I've got then Rothfuss from Page High School said, hey, come be the chaplain. And then that same day I got a phone call from now Pastor BT. But Cross Fellowship was a church plant that had been here and faithfully serving, trying to reach the city, a similar vision. And they've been going at it for about 4 years. And I didn't know this, but he said, hey, could we grab coffee? But I thought, man, I'm gonna get to know another planter in the city. And instead of just getting to know another planter in the city, I go to coffee with him, and he kind of lets me know they've just decided we're just not going to turn the corner, and we're going to try to help our people go to other churches and shepherd them to those other churches. He and Pastor Jeremy Cooper, just like, man, we've loved them, we served them. This is not sustainable, so we're going to try to help them find other churches. And somebody told him about us last minute, so we sat down, and kind of by the end of that meeting, I realized, oh shoot, like he's not just. Like, I'm just not being another planter. He's wondering, should we combine efforts? And knowing BT now, looking back, it's hilarious because BT doesn't do anything fast. And so like that conversation moved quickly. That was quick. Wow, yeah. And so we pushed the launch back, waited about till November, mid-November, and spent time with kind of our core team, their church, getting to know each other, going through membership process together. So we didn't launch until November of that year instead, and we did so with about 35 people total rather than the 14 or 15 or 16 or so that we had, at least in the conversation prior. And the Lord, just gave a ton of grace to that.
Yeah, and I wanted maybe to double-click just a minute on a part of that. That was one of those moments where you look kind of back on the story of King's Cross where we're not exactly following conventional wisdom on how these things work, and the Lord is just pouring out grace on the effort. But that was like, okay, so obviously you and Luke had spent quite a bit of time investing in the core team, aligning vision over the course of months at this point. And you have this conversation with BT, and it's like, wow, we're aligned. I think this is going to happen, this merge. Help me understand or help everybody understand. I think you can put your finger on a few things within that, but BT and Jeremy, their leadership and humility in that effort was integral. And so maybe just speak to how you see that as vital to that the unity and how we launched. But then also, like, man, if that hadn't happened, what would that have looked like?
Sure. Yeah, I think Psalm 127 says, "Unless the Lord builds a house, those who build it labor in vain." And I think all of this in the story of King's Cross has been testimony to the Lord's done it. Like, we had all these, like, people ask me, did you dream it would be going this well? And I'm like, well, yes.
Right.
And I don't mean that arrogantly, meaning like, this is what we moved to do.
Yeah.
But how we got here, not in a million years would I have done it this way.
Amen.
Yeah, I think, in some of that, I remember people telling me, like, all the books, all of the counsel would say, never, take a smaller core team with a new church plant, combine it with a bigger core team of another church plant right before you launch.
That very much had a crystallized culture.
Right?
They had been at this for a long time.
For 4 years, right? Yeah. And so most everybody would say, never do that. And yet in it just felt like, man, I think the Lord is doing it. And particularly as you're getting at with Jeremy and BT, I think both of them kind of said, hey, we just want to be members. We don't want to be pastors. We don't want our congregation to still see us as their pastors and not follow you and Luke's leadership. So we just want to be members, and we want our members to see us submitting to you guys and the vision of this church. And without that, I think it would have been impossible. I think, but because of that, it's like, man, we launched at Kaiser Middle School, and man, there's teardown set up. They had been meeting there previously. That's why we said, all right, we'll start there because the other thing fell apart. So we'll just jump in where you guys have been meeting. And again, that was risky because they had been used to doing stuff there. They were the experts on that, and so just trying to have a new vision and direction was challenging. But their humility, so it's like, man, those first Sundays they go from preaching and leading everything to they're doing the teardown and setup.
Jeremy's in the parking lot,
right?
Just and he did that for the longest.
Absolutely, doing the pipe and drape, and so I think their humility in all of that, because their members, there was a grief to that, there was a sadness, and yet they trusted, Jeremy and BT, and so they followed their leadership, and then I think it was, probably that next February, March, or maybe even January that they became elders at King's Cross. It was really quick, and it was beautiful. And they're all, all their members are crying.
I was going to say that I don't know that there was a dry eye in the spot. I remember that Sunday vividly in that, like, man, they were being installed. We were all crying. It was just beautiful to see the Lord do that. And even for those of us that weren't a part of Cross Fellowship, watching their example,
absolutely, immediately
it was like, no, these guys are,
they're qualified.
This works. Follow them. Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Okay, so you've already alluded to it. We're at Kaiser Middle. We're there for 4-6 months, something like it. It was right at 5, maybe.
Yeah, so it was November till April.
Yeah, because it was
April
Easter.
For Easter. Yeah,
was our first one. I remember there was some snow and ice in March, and so in my mind, this is the tater tot era.
That is the tater tot era.
King's
Square
Cross
pizza and tater tots.
Square pizza and tater tots
in the Kaiser cafeteria.
Yeah. So even I remember even distinctly. So you preached a sermon before launch Sunday over at Kaiser on Matthew 9:35 through 38, and so I'd love for you to speak a little bit to that text, how that text has impacted you, impacted our church, but then also walk through, and I'm happy to speak to some of this too, but that period in the life of our church, what that was like, what was good, what was bad, what was your personal feeling or the feeling of the group during that season, because we weren't there forever, but man, like when I think back on it, it felt like we were there for a long time. And I think some of the circumstances informed that.
I think, that text in my just own personal development and thinking missiologically, but more than that, pastorally about missions. Kind of the language I used was just that we got to live with. So Jesus had open eyes. So he looked at the crowds. He felt compassion for them. Open eyes, broken hearts. So felt compassion for them. And immediately when you do that and you follow Christ and you imagine his disciples with him, watching him look at the crowds, his open eyes, watching his compassion in his own heart. And then I would imagine, and you're like, all right, let's go get after it. Let's go do something. But he turns to him and he says, pray. So pray the Lord of the harvest. And so the first move is to pray. So callous knees. So open eyes, broken heart, callous knees. So the disciples pray. And then in Matthew 10, he sends them out to go do something. Yeah. So then beautiful feet, right? So we go the beautiful feet of the gospel, take the good news of the gospel. So open eyes, broken heart, callous knees, beautiful feet. And so that text has shaped very much how I think about, man, do we look at the crowds? Do we see what he sees? Do we feel what he feels? They're harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then do we stop and say, no, we can't. Yeah. We can't do this. We need the Lord of the harvest to do something about this. Yeah. And so therefore we pray. But then we go share the faith. We go serve. We go declare good news and display good deeds that commend that good news. And so during that season, I think teaching that and saying, let's do that. But then again, we're in a middle school cafeteria. It stinks, every Sunday morning of whatever they have for Friday lunch. And again, the joke is always square pizza and tater tots. But, that season was hard because it's like, Lord, this doesn't feel like the right location. This doesn't feel on the tracks the way we want it to be. Yep. The other church building was. And now we're spending all this time trying to form this we're trying to get to know each other between these two churches. So it's slowing down our ability to reach out to the community and know people because we're trying to figure each other out. And then, man, when it comes to multi-ethnic, multi-generational, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in different podcasts, man, music's important, culture's important. And so trying to have conversations and feedback. So they brought with them, with Cross Fellowship, lots of the music and leaders that were incredible, wonderful people. But then it's like, man, we got to rethink some of this stuff. And those are tender conversations to have. How do you make tweaks and changes? And so, yeah, that season was, whatever it was, 5-6 months, whatever it was, it felt much longer. Yeah. And a portion of that was pastorally. Also, the fact that Cross Fellowship had been doing this for 5 years, 4 or 5 years, set up, tear down, set up, tear down. Mm-hmm. They were exhausted. Mm-hmm. And so then pastorally, I'm like, man, they're tired. I don't want them to have to keep doing this.
Yep.
For the King's Cross start, like core team, well, I mean, we're just now doing it. But man, there's more of them than us in this, and we've become one, and therefore, I'm like, our people collectively are exhausted.
Right.
So that season was an interesting season of, okay, Lord, like we're trying to get off the ground, and it's like any other church plant. That first Sunday, man, we got friends from all over the place, from Raleigh, from Charlotte. There's 200 and something, 50 people in the room. It's super diverse. It's incredible. And then weeks 2, 3, 4, and 5, it's like cut in half. Man, it's not as diverse, and so then it's like, Lord, this is a long uphill battle that we gotta get after. So, yeah, that was but the Lord was faithful, and I think that season, knitting the hearts, particularly of Jeremy and BT and me and Luke together for a unified vision on what to do. And then, and I'm sure we'll probably have to pause and do part 2 of some of this story. But that's, Pastor Hez visited one Sunday. So Pastor Hez shows up, and I'm like, hey, nice to meet you. Where are you from? And he said Raleigh. And I'm like, why are you here? Like, you just drove an hour and a half for church. And so Deuce, a good friend at Southeastern, had told Hez, and so suddenly he comes in. We hired Jonathan in January to do music, which is a whole nother story that we could talk about, how that happened. And so it kind of in that window, I would say there was lots of, man, this is going to be complex and slow and difficult. And yet we saw these glimpses, unity with the Cross Fellowship core team, unity with the King's Cross core team, those two coming together. Pastor Hez coming and the Lord sending him. Like, it's not, again, he built that. Like, I didn't go find Hez and recruit Hez. The Lord sent him through a friend. And then Jonathan, I ran into in a Chick-fil-A parking lot when he was on his lunch break. I'd met him years prior. We hadn't talked to each other in years. And so just kind of the way the Lord did some of that, there was these glimpses of hope and where we're headed. But also this, like, man, it's going to take longer than we anticipate. If that makes sense. Yeah,
and I think you're absolutely right. That's worth just even the integral aspect of those two brothers and their role in those early days. That's worth talking about at length somewhere down the road. But even within that, I remember back when we were voxing all the time. I remember voxing you a lot.
Shout out to Voxer.
Shout out to Voxer. I remember.
Shout out to no longer using Voxer.
Guys, just so you know, we've gone through seasons where we've got like 6 apps for communication.
My goodness,
we're bringing it together. Voxer is one of those past eras, but I remember voxing you a lot in October, November, December. Really fired up on launch Sunday, and then just being really discouraged. As a young believer, right? I'm about a year in the faith, and I'm looking around, and I'm zealous, and I'm impatient, and so the Lord hasn't done it immediately, and so I'm prone to get discouraged. But I just remember this abiding sense of, no, the Lord is behind this, and this isn't just something subjectively apart from community. I feel like this was what you were communicating to me in your responses and your just general posture. It was like, no, we really think the Lord is in this, and He's behind this, and so just be patient. And so we just waited on the Lord.
Absolutely.
So we fast forward. We get March. There's all kinds of bad weather. Like, I'm just thinking about the parking lot over there. I feel like this is spring of 18. We had some snow and some ice over at Kaiser. We're rolling the like tear down setup hundreds of yards from the gym. There were stacks and stacks of chairs coming. It was just a lot. I mean, it was a whole affair. And I remember in March or April, like, man, like, something's got to give because the members were tired. And so enter South Elm Eugene. So personally, I feel like this is where the DNA of King's Cross really crystallized and was a beautiful season for us as a church. So maybe talk a little bit about how that came to be downtown, and then also what it was about that particular space,
that
location,
absolutely.
that I think it was vital to our
absolutely.
formation as a church.
Yeah,
so speak to all of that, and even we can hit some of the fun
The
experiences.
stories.
Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. Next podcast, Pastor Clint saying we love you, and part 2 of the King's Cross story on the next one. We'll pick up. It's too fun. We keep doing it, but let's make it part 2. Love you guys. Grace and peace.